Koloff hammering away on the midsection of Bruno Sammartino, kicking him into the midsection now. Koloff pulls him out, has him in the air. Big body slam. Here's the cover, 1, 2. And Sammartino still able to kick out. Now Koloff going for the slam. Again. And again, just a count of 2. Sammartino with Ivan Koloff up in the air, and I mean he really slammed him. Again, how's him up there? Could be over. Count of 2 again. Nip and tuck all the way. However, Ivan Koloff rolled off the apron of the ring and is now, as you see, on the outside of the ring. Apparently trying to catch a... Oh, now it's Sammartino who will not let Ivan Koloff in. Again, Sammartino comes over. So, Bruno Sammartino giving Ivan Koloff a little... Wait a minute, they're both out there. Look out! Ivan Koloff picked up a chair while on the outside of the ring and leveled Bruno Sammartino.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Season 4 of Grappling with Canada. As usual, I'm your host, the Taxman. I hope that everybody had a very safe, but more importantly, a very fun holiday season, and I'm looking forward to a tremendous 4th season of the Grappling with Canada podcast. If this is your first time to the program, welcome. You can find past episodes in the podcast platform that you are currently listening to this program on, whether that's iTunes, RSS, Spotify, wherever you buy, sell, trade, barter, or steal your favorite podcasts, you'll find Grappling with Canada in the aforementioned back catalog. They are tremendous episodes on previous subject matters, such as Stu Hart and Stampede Wrestling, Dino Bravo, George Gordienko, Bruiser Bob Sweetan, and many more. So feel free to check those out after you listen to this program, of course. Also, while you're here, if you wouldn't mind hitting that follow or subscribe button, that would mean a great deal to me. You can also find this podcast on YouTube. Simply use that wonderful YouTube search bar and search for Grappling with Canada. You will find this program. Also want to make mention quickly that you can find Grappling with Canada on all major social media platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or X, whatever they call it now. Simply search for Grappling with Canada, and I hope that you will also join us in the Canadian Professional History Facebook group. There's been a lot of tremendous postings in there, so come along and join us in the Canadian Professional Wrestling History Facebook group. You can find links to all this information in the Linktree link in today's show notes. Now, the reason we're all here today, we're going to be having a tremendous conversation regarding somebody who, in my opinion, it's an absolute shame and travesty for them not to be included in WWE's Hall of Fame. And yes, we will be getting into the validity of said Hall of Fame, but that's a topic for a little bit later in tonight's conversation. But somebody who should be in there nonetheless, for a plethora of reasons, is the incredible Ivan Koloff. Tonight, I'm very pleased to be joined by two amazing guests who are really going to set the stage, not just for Ivan Koloff, the wrestler, but Ivan Koloff, the person, and how he really shaped people's, we'll say, feelings towards professional wrestling. We're getting into a lot that later with my two tremendous guests. we have Benny Scala. You may have heard of him from a plethora of podcasts that he's been on, as well as his tremendous articles in ProWrestlingStories.com. Also joining the program is longtime friend and good friend of the show, reoccurring guest, Evan Ginsberg. Now, these two gentlemen are going to be providing tremendous insight, not only into what Ivan Koloff meant to the WWF, but also wrestling in general, and just the absolute cultural icon that he was during his major runs, and also some, let's say, lesser known runs that are equally as impressive. I'm really looking forward to getting into that in just a few minutes. But I think the best way to do this, as we normally do on Grappling with Canada, is to kick this program off with some classic wrestling audio. So please enjoy the abusive stylings, if you will. Ivan Koloff getting into a little bit of trouble with Pat Patterson. Please enjoy.
Well, I tell you, one thing that, to me, what he does all the time is always puts down American wrestling. He is superior. He is better.
All right, well, we'll return, ladies and gentlemen, as we continue with the next matchup. Ivan Koloff on his way back to the dressing room with another victory chucked under his belt. Ivan Koloff obviously wanting to have an interview. Mr. Patterson, I think you're being summoned, if you would.
Well, he must have something very important to say.
All right. We'll go now, if we can, set up an interview. Pat Patterson on his way down now to see what Ivan Koloff has on his mind. All right, let's go now to Pat Patterson.
Koloff, obviously, you have something very important to say. Why don't you say what you have to say?
Because every time I have statements about you, I have film on you about saying things about Koloff that are all lies. And I don't like this one bit. You accuse Koloff of breaking rules, using foreign objects in ring to gain victory. You are degrading Koloff all the time. I don't like this. I think you are nothing, Patterson, but a dirty, slimy, filthy, American, prejudiced pig. You understand?
Listen to me, Koloff. When I commentate on your match, I don't lie. I tell the truth. I've always praised you that you're a great wrestler. You're a former world champion, but all you do is degrade the American wrestler. I think American wrestlers are just as great as you are.
I tell you what, Patterson.
I'm not a liar, and the American people know who the liar is. You bald-headed get over here.
After Koloff, Patterson, run in ring. My goodness, Koloff gave him a shot. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Pat Patterson with his commentary, and he is furious. Patterson is furious.
If you're familiar with previous episodes of Grappling with Canada, you'll note that during the start of every episode, I normally go into a deep dive into the individual's personal and private background to give more context for later conversations in that episode. I'm thinking specifically, episodes such as Chief Don Eagle, where his background story is, let's just say, not very accurate in most media. Or somebody like Jack Taylor, whose background story was essentially lost to time until uncovered by some tremendous research. But this episode's a little bit different. The background information on Ivan Koloff actually comes up just in casual conversation with my two guests that you're going to hear in just a little bit, Evan Ginsberg and Benny Scala. So not that it's not important to cover the background of Ivan Koloff, trust me it is, and it's very impressive, as you're going to find out very shortly. but it not only does it come up in a conversation with both of them, but it's also covered extensively by Ivan Koloff himself, with the 2 books that he wrote on him, or I guess co-wrote on himself. Is That Wrestling Fake? The Bare Facts, as well as Life in the Trenches, where he was, in both of them, very straightforward with his personal life, his life before wrestling, but more importantly, his life after wrestling. And that's something that we're going to really be spending quite a bit of time on in the context of this episode, because as much as I want fans who maybe are unfamiliar with Ivan Koloff to research and respect the wrestler, I also want people to respect the man. And I think you will at the end of the conversations that you're going to hear today. Now, without further ado, we're going to be jumping right into my conversation with Benny Scala. Now, I have to apologize. You're going to hear some interesting audio in that episode, mostly from me. And unfortunately, during the course of recording that episode, or that portion of the program, I should say, I had a terrible case of bronchitis. So the cough button was activated many times. But Benny was a great guest. He was a real treat to have on the program. And again, we had just such a great free-flowing conversation that really encapsulates the story of Ivan Koloff, not just from a fan's perspective, but also somebody who's looking at things from a historical mind, and somebody who's looking at things as a nowadays fan, if you will. I think that's probably the best way to say it. So, before we get to that, I will play some more classic audio, and on the other side, my conversation with Benny Scala. Please enjoy.
Just a moment, we will see Nikita Koloff in the ring, and Ivan is with us here at ringside to talk about that match. Nikita Koloff, he is an awesome force, but we're talking about the world heavyweight champion who's the best in all the world.
Well, you are going to see in a few seconds here why Ric Flair has been avoiding Nikita Koloff. Why Ric Flair, every time he hears the name Nikita Koloff, he gets chills all over. Why Ric Flair is very reluctant to sign any contract whenever Nikita Koloff's name is mentioned. Why? Because he knows Nikita Koloff has more power than he has more wrestling ability than this Ric Flair. And he knows, Ric Flair, that it's just a matter of time before Nikita Koloff will destroy him and take world title away from him.
Let's go to the ring. And there he goes.
You see, Nikita, he doesn't waste any time. He just goes after his opponent, demolish him. You see, Ric Flair, you don't have a chance. You might as well stay back in the shadows.
Talk to it. Oh, Ric Flair's here.
I've been downstairs, and I'm sick and tired of you running your mouth. Come here, Koloff. Telling you right now, get out of the way, Tony. I'm sick and tired of you running your mouth. Nikita Koloff don't mean nothing to me. You don't mean nothing. This is America. We do what we want to do. We want to get dressed up pretty. We get dressed up pretty. We want to wear blue jeans. We wear blue jeans. We want to go out and good-looking women. We go out and good-looking women. This is America. Well, Man of the Year, Ric Flair, we're not afraid of you. You're going to find out that you're not man enough for Nikita Koloff, my nephew. You know, I made that comment a couple weeks ago that I just might make him my personal gardener. I'm looking for a chauffeur. And if you want a job driving my car around, you are hired right now. Don't you insult me, Ric Flair. No, don't you insult the name of Koloff right now. Because you're going to got a problem. You want to get this resolved. Why don't you and I come over here right now, huh? You want to get this resolved? Come on, big man. You want to get this resolved? Come here, brother. Come on, brother. Come on.
My goodness. Nikita Koloff from behind, David. He got the champion from behind. And now he is ripping off that suit of his. Oh, my goodness. He's ripping his clothes right off.
All righty. So, Benny Scala, 68 years old, became a fan. So it's kind of a little bit of a long story, but I remember it was either 1966 or 1967. back then you had one TV in the family. And I remember, walking into the living room on a Saturday, and for whatever reason, professional wrestling was on, which was never on in my house. But at that precise moment, serendipity, Ray Morgan was interviewing Bruno Sammartino. And so I just got transfixed. Like, who is this guy? I mean, Bruno looked like a Superman to me. I'm 12 years old. And, at the end of every interview, Ray Morgan would always ask Bruno, hey, Bruno, how about saying a word for your Italian fans? And of course, both of my parents, spoke fluent Italian. My mom she was always in the kitchen. That's what Italian mothers did, 24/7. I said, Mom, come here. And she actually translated what Bruno said. And she says, man, that guy is very classy, because he was just thanking his fans for all the support, typical Bruno stuff. And so I really didn't give it a second thought, but the Christmas of 1967, because I was a huge sports fan. I watched, baseball, basketball, foot. I was the four sport guy, and I would hog the family TV set. And I guess my parents got tired of that, and I got a 12-inch Hitachi TV, black and white, for Christmas 1967. So I brought it up to my room. They figured I got rid of this kid till he's like 21. But I vividly remember on a Saturday night, fooling around with the TV, and I discovered the UHF dial, messing with that, get the channel 47, which was from Newark, New Jersey, and it just happened to be right at the moment that wrestling, and I just see this thing that says Lucha Libre, and I thought, I knew the station was Spanish. I thought, well, maybe I can at least watch and, maybe just watch the action. As it turned out, it was Capital Wrestling from the National Arena, Washington, D.C. It was Ray Morgan, same guy. And it was all in English. And, wow. So now I'm really hooked. Right. And, so now this is early 68. A couple of months later, they happened to be appearing at the Island Garden. So it was like kind of a spot show. And I asked my dad. My dad wasn't a wrestling fan, but he knew how much, he knew that I was becoming a huge wrestling fan. And so he took me. I bet he paid like $6 for 2 tickets. But I remember the main event was Bruno versus Toru Tanaka. And
holy smokes.
Yep. And so at the end, they both start running the ropes. And when they collided, I swear to God, I still remember it. The sound that it made, it felt like an earthquake when they collided. And, I'm thinking like, is Bruno going to get up? I had my heart in my throat. Finally, Bruno gets up right at the count of 9. Tanaka stays down. Bruno wins the match. And, this guy, I do remember there was a 6-man. I got to walk up to Edouard Carpentier.
Oh, the Flying Frenchman.
Oh, yeah. And, he was, I forget who his 2 partners were. It was a best 3 out of 5 6-man match. I shook his hand. You could do that back then. And then a couple of months later, it was next month, May of 1968, my best friend who lived next door, it was his birthday, and my mom let me cut school so I could go with him to the Huntington Mall on Long Island. And I brought some money with me. Very first, you walk into the mall, there's a bookstore. And I used to like Mad magazines back in the day. I think they were like 30 cents. And I thought, maybe I could pick up a Mad magazine. Lo and behold, the first thing I see is Wrestling World. And then I see Wrestling Review. Then I see the Ring Wrestling. So P.S., like 5 minutes after I walked into the mall, I was broke.
Yeah.
But when I got home, now the thing was though, like I think the first article I saw was about the Infernos with J.C. Dykes. They wrestled, I guess, in the Carolinas maybe. And I'm thinking, like, I don't know who these guys are. In my mind, all of wrestling was what I saw on Saturday night. Bruno and Tanaka and Earl Maynard and Victor Rivera and Hans Mortier and those guys. All of a sudden, it's like, wow, there's other wrestling. And after that, I was completely hooked, line and sinker. Every spare penny for the next probably 5 years went towards the purchase of wrestling magazines. And, here we are, 55 years later, still talking about it.
Which is just goes to show you the real grip that, those of us who find it, it almost doesn't matter how you find it. You still get the claws in you And like some of us go in and out, and some of us are gone for a while,
Well,
like myself, and come back in.
I mean, I've taken some hiatuses, but and the funny thing was back then in 67, 68, it was not fashionable for a 12, 13-year-old kid to be a wrestling fan. You found out which of your fellow schoolmates were wrestling fans.
Yeah.
And then you'd walk over to them, like when nobody was around, hey, did you watch Smasher Sloan on Saturday night? And then one of the jocks would start walking towards you, and you'd have to change the conversation. Hey, how about that filet of haddock in the cafeteria? Wasn't that great today? So yeah, I mean, it wasn't fashionable. I mean, that didn't happen for years, but I mean, it didn't matter. I was completely hooked.
Which kind of brings us to today, where now, you write articles, you're a podcast host as well. We'll get into that in a little bit. And the reason you're on tonight is this tremendous article that you wrote on the subject of this episode, Ivan Koloff. Now, we were talking off air to let the people listening at home know, I actually had this episode all buttoned up, ready to go for January 1st. And then I saw your article and I'm like, is this what they call serendipity? I don't know. This is very strange, right? So I start reading it and I'm like, holy smokes, like this, first of all, kind of covered it almost better than I would have, or did, I should say, in my introduction to Ivan Koloff. But more than that, it was such a great insight from somebody who's, you were in that market, right? You were in that fever. So I want to first off just ask, what was it about Ivan Koloff that made you want to write this episode? And was it specifically because you were kind of right in that time frame of where Ivan Koloff comes in and obviously the unthinkable happens?
It's just been like this long, continuous journey with the guy. I mean, obviously, so I'm literally 15 and a half years old on January 18th, 1971. I think I read about it, if I remember right, and there's an article online from the New York Times, but I remember reading in the New York Daily News, which was delivered to us every morning, and there was in the sports section, Koloff defeats Bruno for the title, and I mean, if there was like a headline that said earthquake kills 100,000, I think I would have still been sadder for the Ivan beats Bruno. I mean, not really, but I mean, it was just like my whole world. Like Bruno was my hero. Like that was just absolutely devastating. And it was, I mean, it goes to show though how seriously wrestling was taken back then, that it was even covered in the Times. And I think at the time it set a record for attendance at the Garden for like 21,000. And it said, the funny thing is it set a record gate of like 85,000. So I'm thinking like, oh, some quick math. I'm an accountant. I mean, what was it, like $4.10 average per ticket? So it means like, there were some $5 seats and there were some $3 seats, but imagine going and seeing something like that and paying, even then, like, yeah, I mean, $5 is maybe like what, $30, $40, but still like to see something that historic. So, I mean, of course, like I hated the guy. I mean, just like Jimmy Valiant, who's one of my closest friends in the world right now, I hated his guts when he turned on Chief Jay Strongbow right around the same time. He was a babyface, came in as handsome Jimmy or gentleman Jimmy Valiant, turns on Strongbow. Now he's handsome Jimmy Valiant, managed by the Grand Wizard. And like I hated him too, but then he left. Koloff lost. He dropped the belt. He wrestled all over the place. I mean, what a career the guy had. I mean, for years and years and years, and always a heel, but always on top. Always a main eventer, always winning some kind of belt. And, and the story of how later in life he became a born-again Christian. He actually became a minister. I'm friends with his wife on Facebook. I thought, like, this is, like, one hell of a life. And I just wanted to, just give my take on it. But, and one of the things that, I mean, maybe, like, it was already covered by you, but the fact that this man is not in the WWE Hall of Fame when he recorded what, in my opinion, is probably the most significant victory in the history of professional wrestling. You dethrone a man who was a champion for 7 years and 8 months. If that's not historic, I mean, what is?
See, and that's kind of if listeners at home haven't realized yet, that's kind of the running theme through this episode of the fact that he's not. And I mean, we could go on a tangent, and we probably won't right now, about whether or not the WWE Hall of Fame actually means what we think it means. The reality is that WWE has a reach of billions of people across the world. So, I mean, if you're going to induct somebody like Ivan Koloff, in the posthumous category, you are now exposing him to literally billions of people who weren't even alive when he was on. And like you said, I think you said it perfectly there. Here's a guy who was always a heel, always on top, and people hated him and they paid to go see him. And it's wild, you mentioned what tickets would have been back then, and you hear a gate of 80,000. Oh, that doesn't sound like very much, but when you adjust for inflation and you adjust for what that would mean in today's dollars, like, I mean, we're talking about 80,000 in early 70. That would be off the top of my head almost 5 times. That's a $500,000 house essentially.
Yeah,
and that's before. This is before the advent of merchandising, and this is before the advent of all of these ancillary things that now are so commonplace in wrestling. But it's just fascinating to me that, there's this story, and like you said, it's a fascinating story, and we're going to get into it a lot more detail in just a minute. But from the wrestling side to the personal side, his journey is pretty incredible. And again, regardless of what anybody actually thinks about the validity of the WWE Hall of Fame, just the simple fact of somebody like that going in automatically means that he's going to be that much more accessible to that many more people. And I think that's kind of the bigger picture here that we need to focus on.
Absolutely. And Ivan Koloff, or Ariel Paris, the man, is another story in itself. And just in the course of doing my article, I actually chatted on the phone with Davey O'Hannon, who was one of my favorite wrestlers back in the, late 70s, early 80s, when I used to watch on Saturday afternoon. And he called him Red, even though, I mean, Red McNulty lasted, I think, for a couple of years in the mid 60s, but that was his nickname with the guys, was, Red. And he said that he was just the most incredible human being. And Davey would actually drive him around a lot, and Davey never charged him for trans. And Ivan actually made them stop, and he said, I have to go into it was like a souvenir store, like, I guess like a Cracker Barrel. And he comes out with a gift, and he goes, this is for your father. Because I guess Davey had mentioned that his father was a fan of Ivan. He goes, what's that for? He goes, you never charged me for trans. He goes, this is the least I can do for you. And just Davey went on and on about what a great guy. And I mean, for me, it was a surreal moment. Number one, I'm talking to somebody that I used to boo the crap out of when I was a 20-year-old guy, and now I'm talking to him. Now Davey's a good guy. Davey's a friend. And we're talking about another guy that I absolutely despised as a 15-year-old. And we're talking about what a great guy he is. And I'm thinking, like, wrestling is there's so much more to professional wrestling than what you see on TV. And that's what I really love about it. And that's what I love to write about.
See, and that kind of leads me into another question that I kind of was thinking about, is because with yourself and the Dan and Benny show, I think you're over what, 140 episodes?
I think 150, 157. I think we just did.
Okay, so many episodes, many different topics covered. But how many of these people would have had a connection with Koloff as well, right? Like, if you look at it that way, not only are you, and I'm not saying that your episodes, were on Koloff for those. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is he probably would have been a topic of conversation at some point in one of those 157 episodes. So you kind of factor that into your past with him, then the story you just told, and this kind of all builds into where you kind of go with the article.
Right. Correct.
And it's, again, we're talking about, these guys who, you boo and you hate them and you want to throw things at them. You probably don't want to meet them in person, but then you hear about what a nice guy they are after it's all said and done. I want to get into that, but one of the lines that you had in your article was just kind of referencing how difficult it is sometimes picking up the pieces of somebody's life, professionally speaking, when they go through many name changes. And you just mentioned the Red McNulty name. when you were researching the article, how did you find going through the archives of the many names of Ivan Koloff?
Well, he kind of kept it simple because he started out, I think, and, here's the problem with being, the Major League Baseball. I'm a huge baseball fan. I can look up any player who, Cap Anson, who played for the Chicago Cubs in the 1890s, and I can tell you in 3 seconds how many hits he got, or how many RBIs, or how many home runs. You can't really do that with professional wrestling. The record keeping was very faulty. So there's one database that has an Ivan Zukov wrestling Bruno, I think, in 1963, but then on another database you don't see it. I try to use WrestlingData.com. They show his first match in 1965, I think November, as Oriel Paris, which is his real name, against Bruno in Pittsburgh. And then in January of 66, he wrestled Smasher Sloan, the brute from Butte, on Washington, D.C. TV, from WWF, as Red McNulty. And then that was his one and only appearance there. And then he migrated to Western Canada, and for the next, I guess, maybe 2 years, wrestled as McNulty, kind of, mid-Carter, did, experienced some mild success, nothing special. But it's when in January of 68, he showed up in Montreal as the International Wrestling Association, Johnny Rougeau's promotion. And that's when he first showed up as Ivan Koloff. And that was the name that he kept for the rest of his career. And, we talked about him being, even though he was only a 3-week champion, which I think was a shame in the WWF. I think they could have gotten a lot more out of him. They could have given him a Superstar Graham kind of run before they transitioned to Pedro. I don't think it would have done them any harm. And I think actually it would have done them a lot of good. But little known fact, though, he appeared in the IWA in January. On August the 12th, he beat some guy named Mad Dog Vachon, another legend.
Yeah, some guy.
some jabroni, for their international heavyweight championship, the IWA, which was considered at that time, a world championship. So now he's, WWF champion, IWA champion, and here's like another one on June 18th, 1977. So he's wrestling in Florida, the Eddie Graham CWF Championship Wrestling from Florida. He goes out to Indianapolis, defeats Dick the Bruiser, and another minor legend, right? And wins the WWA World Heavyweight Championship, which he wrestles in Florida, but once a month for the next 5 months, he makes the trip to Indianapolis to defend the championship. And then also once a month, earlier in the month, goes to the Kiel Auditorium and wrestles their monthly card. So this guy is working a heavy-duty territory in Florida, because in Florida they wrestle 7 nights a week. But he made those shots every month, thinking like, man, this guy is in demand. And I have another stat. I can read it later on. I mean, the guy was routinely wrestling between 250 and 290 matches a year. But, I mean, so now
it's unbelievable considering what they do nowadays, right?
I think Roman Reigns has wrestled 11 times this year.
Yeah.
Koloff did that in 2 weeks. But, I mean, so now you have the guy has won, the 3 different world championships. And then he won the WWC, the Puerto Rican championship, in 1989 when he was 47. And, I mean, at the time, that was also considered a world. So here's a guy who's won the equivalent of 4 different world championships, and you're not in the Hall of Fame. That's crazy.
Well, not only that, just strictly speaking championships, but you look at some of the names that he wrestled over that period of time, right? You're talking like, you've mentioned several, whether it's, the Vachons or Carpentier had some wars with him. Dick the Bruiser had matches with him. Whipper Billy Watson, another Canadian legend, had a ton of matches with him. Then you look at the Rougeaus out east, it's incredible. And then we're not even talking about, down in the States, obviously Bruno, Pedro, matches like that. But it's wild to me that, the career portfolio isn't just about championships. It's not also just about high profile matches. And how many sellouts he had. I can't remember if if in your article it had how many sellouts that he had in Madison Square Gardens or not. I don't know if you have that figure off the top of your head.
I think that was actually because Evan Ginsberg did an article about him. I think he said like he sold out like all 13 times he main evented.
That's right. So, and set the all-time gate record, which eventually was broken. Every record is meant to be broken, obviously, but I mean, you're looking at a record that stood for, what was it, about 20 years before they finally broke that record?
Oh, yeah.
So, you add all this up, and then not only the places he was, not only the championships he won, but the longevity of his career. And I mean, here's a guy who wrestled, for God's sakes, he wrestled in ECW as well. Like, think about that one for a second.
Right.
It's absolutely incredible. And, it's a real shame that people nowadays, if they don't even know him for the San Martino streak or the end of his streak, then, like, I'm almost speechless at this point. It's like, what more do you want to, like, kind of vault somebody into that position?
And one of my measures of how great somebody is how much in demand they are. And I mean, I'll read this.
Yes, very true.
So from 1977 to 1987, I'm going to read you how many, and this is from the WrestlingData.com, and even I suspect that these totals are actually understated because, record keeping wasn't a fine science yet. But 77, he wrestled 252 times. 78, 283. 79, 280. 1980, 275. 1981, 285. 1982, 264. 1983, 282. And then you got 269, 287, 236. And in 1987, he wrestled 220 times. So, I mean, you're, from 84 through 87, you're talking about a guy who's in his, early to mid 40s. And he's still in huge demand.
Well, not only demand too, but he's making stars, because you got to figure that's like, he makes Nikita right then too. So it's wild, like, in the twilight of his career, I've put that in quotation marks, but it's wild to me, right? And here's a guy just, from a small town in Canada, and then here you go, right? He's just off to the races, and yeah, it's wild. It's absolutely incredible.
As I said in my article, he went from red as a McNulty to red as, an evil Russian. And he just, the guy, I'll go back to my days as a WWF fan. You had guys like Baron Cicluna, you had Dominic DeNucci, guys like that, who homesteaded, I'll call it, where they didn't really bounce around. And late in their career, in the late 70s and early 80s, they became more of an enhancement talent. They, at that point, they were putting everybody over. And again, they're in their early 50s, they're passing the torch. That all makes sense. But Koloff never really, maybe he slid down on the card a little bit, but he still was a main eventer, even in his mid 40s. He was significant. He was winning, 6-man titles. He was winning, the NWA title with Kernodle and the 6-man with Khrushchev, I guess, Barry Darso. He's still winning significant titles. And if you watch his work, with Jim Crockett in the mid to late 80s, guy didn't slow down a beat. He still was, in superb shape and such a great worker.
Wait, and again, that kind of feeds into this whole, I don't know if we're building a case or what we're doing here. Maybe we're building a case for inclusion in the Hall of Fame, but more so a case for people to, kind of take notice of his career. And, we've been talking a lot about, and actually I should stop and go back to something you just said, is that, you look at a lot of these guys who were homesteaders, which is not always a bad thing either, right? But here's a guy, Ivan, who was all over the map. And again, was a main event star everywhere he went. And the numbers of matches that you just illustrated is pretty remarkable, especially when you're getting into the 1980s and he's still doing 200 plus matches a year. It's right. Pretty incredible. One thing that, I keep coming back to, and it's hard not to, is just, it's that, I guess maybe it's the aura of the Madison Square Gardens and what he meant to that era of those shows in the Madison Square Gardens. Can you take me back? I know we're kind of backtracking a little bit, but I really want to give people like a real tangible taste of it, if you will. What was it like energy-wise? What was it like anticipation-wise? What was it like being a fan at the Gardens, going to those shows from, let's say the late 60s into the mid to late 70s?
It's the polar opposite. And I because I do a lot of podcasts and I try to keep up with the current product. And, for an old timer like me and growing up with the wrestling that I grew up with, sometimes it's painful. And I feel like, and Seth Rollins is a very talented guy, but when he, the way he dresses like Liberace and the whole crowd cheering along, and I mean, they're all having a great time. And I think they are being entertained. And, I guess that's great if that's what you want. But, when you went to a wrestling card at Madison Square Garden, you didn't have that. You were nervous because, especially if you were a Bruno fan and he was wrestling, I don't know, let's say George Steele, for example, who was his nemesis for years. You went there legitimately thinking that, oh my God, can Bruno defeat this guy? I mean, he's done so many bad things. And I mean, it's amazing how, the old Vince Sr., the old WWF, they had this formula. They brought in a heel from a different territory. They a lot of times, they brought in Bob Orton Sr., they renamed him Rocky Fitzpatrick. And because, there's no social media, nobody knows, right? And so he starts beating up having the squash matches. Then he'll beat, usually the litmus test was Arnold Skaaland because he was Bruno's manager. So he had to either attack Skaaland or beat Antonio Pugliese, who was Bruno's quote unquote cousin. And once he did that, now you're ready for Bruno. And the buildup was absolutely incredible. It took a couple of months. That now you have a match at the Garden with Bruno, which by now has had so much hype that, it's a sellout. And a lot of these challengers were so formidable, like a Tanaka. To me, Tanaka was scary. Killer Kowalski was scary. And, you went to these matches, and you weren't going to be entertained. Nobody sang. There was no entrance music. All of a sudden, you were sitting down, and you heard murmuring, and then it got louder and louder, and it was Bruno, walking down the aisle. And it just got, to the point where, I thought the only louder pop I ever heard was, and I'll relate how old I am. So Thanksgiving Day in 1974, I went to see Elton John play at Madison Square Garden.
Holy moly.
Okay, but it gets better. So the host, the MC, was a guy named Murray Kaufman, who was a disc jockey in New York. His gimmick name was Murray the K. So Murray the K says, well, we have a special surprise guest. And thinking, who could that be? Maybe somebody. And it was John Lennon. And I thought the place was going to explode. And they sang, I think it was the first time they ever did it, Whatever Gets You Through the Night.
Wow.
Which became a huge #1 hit. But that was the only thing that I can compare, when the crowd saw Bruno, was that one night at Madison Square Garden. But people were going to see Bruno. Bruno wasn't just people go to see Seth Rollins. They like Seth Rollins, People went to see Bruno because they loved Bruno. They adored Bruno. They had pictures of Bruno, you're talking about a largely Italian population in New York in the 60s. People joke that they had pictures of the Pope, Jesus Christ, and Bruno Sammartino above their fireplace. No, but it's serious. That's how serious it was. And, Bruno, he made the remark many, many times that after Koloff pinned him, that he thought he had sustained hearing damage because, he couldn't, it was so quiet. The crowd was so quiet. They were shocked. They were absolutely shocked that Bruno had lost it. No, I couldn't have seen that. And then Bruno said after a while he heard people crying. And I mean, and then as he left, people were saying, "We love you, Bruno." So it was just, I mean, the whole makeup of the crowd and the whole gamut of emotions back then was the polar opposite. But, unfortunately, wrestling has become a very, I call it an, impersonal sport because, I live in Tampa. I live outside of Tampa. If I'm lucky, the WWE comes here maybe twice a year. But, as a fan growing up in the 70s, once I got my driver's license, I lived about 15 minutes from the Nassau Coliseum. They had a card every month. I could go to the Garden every month. They had, spot shows. So, I mean, I could go to see wrestling 30, 40 times a year. Now I can maybe see it twice, and it's just not the same. I think the fact that you could go so often, you felt like you were a part of it, and you don't feel that way anymore.
Well, not only that, but and this is kind of an interesting side note, I guess, but it almost seems like nowadays the WWE is built around the WWE. It's not built around a Bruno, or it's not built around a Hulk Hogan, or it's not built, there's really no star that transcends the company like it used to be back in the day, like a Piper or anybody, right? We've seemed to have lost that over the years. Even in the 90s, you had, The Rock or Austin or whoever. We don't have that person anymore. And maybe it is because you don't get the 40 dates anymore. So it's hard to kind of build that connection. And then, you don't run into the wrestlers at the bar anymore. You don't run into the wrestlers at the mall anymore. They're in your town and then they're gone.
Yeah,
so
you can't wait until, you could actually wait until Bruno left the Garden and he would sign autographs.
That's what I mean.
He didn't set up a table and say, okay, we're going to do a quick meet and greet. No, everybody's going to have to pay $20. I mean, he just signed for everybody.
Yeah. Also, leave your credit card because.
Right. Yeah. He had a little imprinter in his briefcase.
Yeah. So I think that might be a big part of it too. It's that connectivity.
Right.
So when you see it big time when you look at the old tapes, right? Of just, people use the term over, but it's not, there's a level of connection that fans had with the wrestlers back in that day, with the ones they loved and sure with the ones they hated, because, for as much as people would go to pay to see someone like a Bruno, or they would pay to see someone like a Pedro, or pay to see someone like Hogan, they would also pay to see that heel get his ass kicked. You know what I mean?
Well, and I'm glad you said that because, and I know Evan's going to be a part of the show, but the movie 350 Days, which I've seen a couple of times, there's a gentleman, not very well known. His name is Howard Jerome. And I think he wrestled actually as a German heel. But he said something that has resonated with me that I'll never forget. He said, there's a fundamental longing in the human heart to see good triumph over evil. And I think, and that was the premise of professional wrestling for years and years and years, that, the babyface gets attacked and, or Bruno got attacked and they go to the Garden and maybe Bruno loses by DQ. So they're going to do it again next month, and that's another sellout. And maybe if it's really good, it leads to a third match. Now you have 3 sellouts at Madison Square Garden, and you move to the next heel. But it was always that ultimate, good versus evil, and eventually good won, even though it might have taken a little bit of time. But nowadays, those lines are completely blurred.
Yeah, which again, that's a big thing that we've lost over the years. And, everybody loves their realism, I guess, but there's still a way to do it and have those lines, in my opinion. The formula is it's not that complicated if you really boil it down, but you need to have people who need the perspicacity to actually pull it off, right? You need somebody who wants to be like, I'm not saying be like Bruno, but carry themselves like Bruno, and we really don't have a whole lot of people like that nowadays. I know we're going on a whole tangent about new stuff. Maybe we'll get back to Koloff, but that kind of feeds into it too, because without a heel like Koloff and somebody who takes himself seriously as a heel, you can't have that all-star babyface. So I mean,
no, I mean he's the protagonist, I mean, or the antagonist rather. I mean, Bruno doesn't sell at the Garden unless he has a Koloff or a Tanaka or a Monsoon back in the day, to have the match with. So yeah, I mean, it was very important. And I mean, who played it better than Koloff? And he never, he never faltered, just consistently for 2 decades playing evil Russian heel.
So as we step out of your fandom side and into we'll say the writing side, the historical side, were you surprised at all to learn just how nice of a guy Koloff was outside the ring?
Yeah, that's to me the most satisfying part of writing a story. And I'll give another example. I had Mike Cicluna, the son of the great Baron Mikhail Cicluna,
yes,
on the podcast, because I did want to write a story about his dad, who was he was one of the few heels that I actually liked, back in the day. There was just something so intriguing about him, just the way he carried himself with that robe with the Maltese cross, and he was so big and had that scowl, and always had the roll of quarters in his pocket or dimes. I always justified it. I said, well, that's in case one of the fans after the matches need to do their laundry or make a phone call. That he just has it handy. He's a good guy, But to hear his son talk about this man, that a side of him that we never saw, that that he was a good dad, that he always tried to be there, that he was on the. I mean, back then those guys, I mean, they were on the road, 300 days a year, but that when he was home, he was completely devoted to his family, and those guys had a very hard life back then. But and the same thing, Davey O'Hannon, I talked to him about Baron Cicluna, and he said he used to babysit Davey's kids. I mean, this is the guy who he was choking people out and hitting them with can openers and stuff like that. But he's playing in the backyard with a 3-year-old
somebody about babysitting your kids,
right? But he said he thought the absolute world of they called him Mike, and he got him. Davey was in the union, I guess, with the newspapers, and he got a lot of those guys. He got Johnny Rods, S.D. Jones, Cicluna, DiNucci, got them all jobs with the New York Times, where they made some decent money. It's very alarming that back then those guys did not make a lot of money. The ones before Vince Jr., they didn't make a lot of money. They went from town to town. But I mean, think of the wear and tear. Imagine being away from your family on Christmas or New Year's or Thanksgiving, or your kid's birthday or graduation or whatever. But that's the life that they lived in. I always say that there was no PTO in professional wrestling back in the 70s. You broke your finger, you could wrestle tomorrow and get paid, or don't wrestle and don't get paid. And these guys had bills to pay. It was a very tough life. But that was. I mean, what I love the most about doing the research and the writing is learning about the behind the real person, and a lot of it, like the camaraderie that these guys had with each other. That it's very, very heartwarming.
Yeah, and again, it's not something that you would know unless you were in the know back in the day. Right now, you can read about it online, and it's, again, we're talking about things that have been lost, in later generations, but. It is interesting. I know for myself personally, when you're researching these individuals, and through the years, I kind of heard that Koloff, in real life was a good guy, but I didn't realize how good of a guy he was, right? And then you start to learn about how he really turned his life around. Got out of the drugs, got out of the partying, and all that kind of stuff, and he had his turn to religion after it's all said and done. And then ends up starting a ministry as well, as I believe.
Yes.
So it's like here's a guy who, again, you wouldn't think that this hated heel who broke Madison Square Garden's heart would later in life run a ministry. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and his wife told me that Bruno was actually his hero. And Bruno was instrumental in bringing him into the WWF because I guess, when he first wrestled Bruno in Pittsburgh, he made enough of an impression. But that's one thing people don't know about Bruno. Bruno brought a lot of these guys in. He brought in Toru Tanaka. He saw him in Hawaii. He brought in George Steele. He brought in, he brought all these guys in. He brought in Koloff. And Renee, his wife, Koloff's, Ivan's widow, said that when he would talk on the phone with Bruno, he behaved like a 12-year-old child.
Oh my God.
And it's funny when she told me that because I remember that when I spoke to Bruno on the phone for the first time. I wrote a tribute about Bruno on Facebook, and one of my good friends, his name is Mike Miggott, actually lives in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and did some printing work for Bruno, and became good friends with Bruno as a result of it. And he goes, I'm taking Bruno out to dinner for his birthday tomorrow. Would you mind if I read him your tribute? I said, would I mind? Are you kidding me?
Wow.
And yeah. And then he goes, well, don't be surprised if Bruno calls you. And I said, yeah, whatever, right? Like, sure, and I'll probably see Elvis at Burger King tomorrow too. And sure enough, and I worked at a car dealership at the time, and as a finance manager, and you can get like crazy busy in that kind of job. As luck would have it, 6 o'clock, which I would normally be swamped, phone rings. It's my friend Mike, he goes, there's somebody that wants to talk to you. And I'm thinking, like, this is going to be a rib. This is going to be somebody who sounds like Bruno. And, but Bruno's voice was unmistakable. And what he said to me was, Benny, where did you learn to write those beautiful words?
Wow.
And I said, Bruno, when you write from the heart, it's easy. And I became a 12-year-old. It was 1968 all over again for me. And this was like 2017. And, I chatted with him for about 10 minutes, and about a week later, Mike called me and said, Bruno's planning a big get-together Christmas week at Rico's, which is a restaurant in Pittsburgh. And he said he wants to know if you'd like to attend. It's like, would I like to attend? Like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
I swear to you, within a half an hour, I had my plane ticket bought. I had my hotel room reserved. I had I didn't rent the car. I had an Uber, but I arranged for the PTO at work. And it was one of the best nights in my entire life.
That's absolutely incredible. Like, what do you say to that, right? Would you like to go? Yeah.
Well, let me think about that for a minute. Yeah, okay.
Let me just clear my calendar real quickly here.
But I'm sitting. This is a man that I idolized growing up, and here I am. I guess I would have been at the time 61, 62, talking to Bruno about each of our moms and like what their what Italian dish they cook the best. This is what we're not talking about Toru Tanaka and Kowalski. Hey, Bruno, did your mom make braciole? Oh yeah, but she really made the boy her ziti was good. This is the conversation we're having.
Wow, that's incredible. I couldn't even put myself in those shoes.
It was. I had to pinch myself 100 times over.
Which is, and again, like how wild is it that you have that experience with Bruno, like you said, you're Facebook friends with Koloff's widow. Like, what a small world this whole wrestling thing is sometimes, eh?
And the funny thing is now, as a result of that, I about 6 months later, I wrote the story about it, about my experience with Bruno. I called it Bruno's Last Christmas. And that was my first story for Pro Wrestling Stories.
No way, I didn't realize that.
Yes. And I think Ivan's was my 34th. But, but as a result of that, I got invited to be on a podcast. It was called Wrestling with the Future. And as a result of my appearance, I guess they liked me enough. They said, hey, would you like to be a semi-regular? I said, I get to talk about wrestling once a week? Yeah, count me in. And so I did that for a bit. And then Dan Sebastiano, who was also on the show, and because the host of the show wanted to get more into non-wrestling stuff. Conspiracy theory, things like that. And we thought, you know what, we're wrestling guys. So we decided to spin off on our own. And, that's what we've done for the last 3 years. But it was all because of that night at Rico's restaurant. If I didn't have that night, I don't think any of this ever would have happened.
That's unbelievable. Unbelievable. Just one simple thing like that just changes an entire trajectory.
Because I posted a tribute to Bruno on Facebook. Yeah.
Wow, that's you blow my mind. What can I say? That's unbelievable. Wow. What do you say to that?
I mean, and I'm thinking like, geez, like, I mean, all of this has happened, and well, Bruno I think passed away in 2018.
2018.
Yeah. So I mean, all of this has happened in the last 5 years. I've been on like probably a total of 200 podcasts. You know, counting besides mine. Well, about another 50, not counting mine. You know, I've written 34 stories, and I've made like, if you look at my cell phone, I mean, I have like all these wrestlers' numbers in there, and I can actually call these guys and they'll talk to me. Like, you know, they won't tell me to piss off. It's like, hey, Benny, how you doing? And, you know, I can even text Ken Patera about hookers and he'll answer me back. You know? I mean, how great is that? But I mean, it's just, I tell people, like, you know, if I wasn't so old, I'd keep pinching myself. Now there's like a risk of clotting, so I don't do that very often. But it's just, I mean, my sister, she goes, the way you loved wrestling and what's happening to you now is like, it's like a dream come true.
Yeah, it's wild, like, the doors that get open sometimes just doing a simple story. Not a simple story, but you know what I mean, right? You do a little bit of legwork and all of a sudden you're introduced to this person and now you're following this story and now you're formulating, now you're 34 articles in, like you said. And 250, well, now it'll be 251 podcast episodes, I suppose, by the time this one comes out. But yeah, just what a wild ride, hey?
Oh, yeah. And I mean, another example is Jimmy Valiant. So, I mean, again, I hated Jimmy Valiant. And we've had him on the podcast a couple of times, but I made the trip to his camp, BWC, Boogie's Wrestling Camp, which I am the commissioner now. But, you know, very first thing, you know, I shook his hand. Hey, Jimmy, we had already done the podcast, so he knew who I was. I said, you know, hey, Jimmy, I'm Benny. I said, you know, by the way, I really hated you when I was a kid. It was the first thing I said to him. And he laughed. I said, when you turned on Strongbow, I hated you. I called you every name in the book. And for once, like, I didn't get in trouble because my mom wasn't in the kitchen, like, nearby. You know, I got away with it. And, like, he just started laughing. But, you know, like, I have that kind of, it's just, all of these people are just the salt of the earth. They're just people. And they're so grateful that people still remember them.
And that's, you know, that's what we're really trying to do here too, right? Is to remember their stories properly and put it in the proper context and really, you know, give fans a chance to, one, rediscover the individual, but two, learn about them in a new light, you know, presented factually, presented properly without a bunch of, you know, innuendo, if you will. And that's really, you know,
right.
That's always been my approach with this program. And it really helps when, you know, I could talk to people like yourself who, like, again, that the article that you wrote on Koloff is just unbelievable. And there is going to be a link to that article in today's show notes. So when you're listening to this episode, folks, very simply, you check in the show notes. There's going to be a link to the article as well as a link to the Dan and Benny show as well. So I can't thank you enough for ruining my podcast schedule, but more than that, I'm so glad that you put this thing out and I was actually able to have this conversation with you to get this information out there. Because this, like I said, what a serendipitous thing this all was.
Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure. I mean, I think until my dying breath, I will never stop, you know, enjoying chatting about wrestling with anybody. It's just, you know, it's just such a pleasurable thing, especially, you know, the wrestling that I grew up loving.
Now, because I don't want to take up too much of your time tonight, before I let you go, is there anything that we didn't cover about Koloff that you want to get into before I let you go?
No, I mean, just, I really wanted to, like, I had written it down that, you know, the fact that he was working in Florida, but then he's the reigning WWA champion, which is a whole different territory. You know, Florida's Graham, WWA in India is Bruiser, and then he's wrestling for Sam Muchnick once a month. You could do that back then. I mean, we had Ken Patera on the podcast, and one of Patera's claims to fame was in the span of 4 days, he won the Intercontinental Championship from Pat Patterson, And then within 4 days, he beats, I think it was Kevin Von Erich for the NWA Missouri Heavyweight Championship. I mean, both of those titles back then, I mean, IC title's a prop now, but back then, you know, and you know, at that time, it was a legitimate title. It was really like the precursor to the World Heavyweight Championship. And the NWA Missouri title was same thing. I mean, if you look at the men who won that title, it's a Hall of Fame right there. And you got Harley Race, you got Von Erich. I mean, you got Backlund, you got Patera, Briscoe. Anybody who was anybody won that championship. So, I mean, this guy is winning titles in two different promotions 4 days apart. It'd be like MJF, like traveling to going on SmackDown and like, you know, winning the U.S. championship. It's like, you're not going to see that.
I think some of us would maybe rather see him on that show, but I think might be a whole different conversation.
Wouldn't that be great? I mean, what kind of ratings would they get if something like that happened? That's a whole other. I mean, that's a whole different podcast. Is, you know, the ratings. You know, the ratings now versus the ratings, you know, 25 years ago, and then the ratings maybe like 50 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. That's why this is a tangent again, but, you know, I always get a chuckle when you see on, you know, the whatever Facebook group nowadays, we're in another wrestling boom. It's like, you guys don't know what you're talking about. You have no idea.
No, I mean, and I don't think anybody's done the analysis. I wonder if Jim Cornette would do it, but if you took, you know, back in the day when there's 25, 30 territories, I mean, you think each one of them had their own TV show, because that's how you know, that was the formula. You did your interviews and your squash matches on TV, and that built up to whatever show you had. But I mean, if you took 30 of these shows around the country every week, I guarantee you, like, the combined viewership was like multiple times more than are watching on a Monday or a Friday night.
I think they might have got that in Memphis alone, to be honest with you.
So, I mean, like, I almost want to do a story. It's like, where did all the wrestling fans go? I mean, even now, I mean, if SmackDown's getting 2.2 million and Raw is getting like 1.5 million, well, you know that the same million and a half that watch Raw on Monday night are probably watching SmackDown. So, I mean, they're not, you know, it's not unduplicated. So, I mean, let's just say maybe 2.5 million they have. Well, I mean, what were the ratings for a Saturday Night Live back in the 80s with Hulk and 15 million people? Maybe.
Yeah, for the main events, yeah, it was about that. And I think that the one with Andre, was it not 20? I want to say.
I mean, where did those millions? I mean, even the Monday Night Wars. You know, when like maybe Raw was, you know, 7 million and Monday Nitro was another 6 million. You had like between 10 and 15 million people watching wrestling on a Monday night. Where did they all go?
Yeah.
The AEW has like that little niche, but like, you know, maybe, you know, 750,000. So maybe combined, you have 3 million people watching wrestling as opposed to, you know, 13, 14 million in the late 90s. Like, where those people go? They moved on. It's sad.
Well, it is, and it's, you know, we joke that it's not like it used to be, but it's not like it used to be, not even close.
No.
And like even friends, you know, my friends, we'll talk about it, like, you know, how it used to be that you would anticipate, you know, watching like a Monday Night Raw, or you'd anticipate watching the pay-per-view because you wanted to see not even the show, but you wanted to see one person, or you wanted to see one match specifically, or, you know, there was something you had to see. Now it's
I remember watching, like, when Sting originally did the Crow gimmick, and he didn't speak for about a year. You know, I would watch every Monday night just to see what he would do. Because they kind of built upon it. Now that was the thing. You built your storylines. Where now, you know, somebody fights at, you know, 8:15, and then they have their blow off match at 10:30. Like, the entire storyline was consummated in 2.5 hours. There's no build to it.
Yes. Yeah, and now it's definitely not like that. Now it's more of a talking extravaganza.
Now it's a sing along, and it's an entertainment.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the sing-along. It's an apt description.
Yeah.
All right. So before I let you go for the night, just real quick, do you want to let everybody know where they can find you, your social media and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I'm just Benny Scala, the player on, there's a long story behind that on Facebook, but I write for Pro Wrestling Stories, Dan and Benny in the Ring. It's found on the Monty and the Pharaoh YouTube channel. It's also on any, audio podcast platform, but I've recently branched out a little bit. So now I've done about 5 episodes of a true crime podcast, which I'm a huge fan of true crime.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, I've done episodes on Charles Manson, Albert DeSalvo, the guy Ronald DeFeo. I don't know if you remember the Amityville Horror. It's probably way before your time, but guy went home from a night of drinking and killed his whole family of 6.
Yep.
And then somebody bought the house, and supposedly there was a lot of eerie goings on after that. But yeah, and then my last episode was on Tammy Sitch, Sonny.
Oh, yes. There's a wrestling tie-in.
She's a criminal in her own right now. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And then my next one's going to be on Whitey Bulger, who, was the mob boss in Boston. The Irish organized crime for many, many years. So got that. And then recently started a baseball podcast called the Line Drive Baseball Podcast. And then we do a show called, this is the one I really, really enjoy. It's called The 30 on Thursday nights live on the Monty and the Pharaoh channel. Mike Monty is the moderator. I'm one of 4 panelists, and he'll throw out like a random current wrestling topic, and we have 90 seconds to give our take. And then we get, he's the judge, so we get points on our takes. And we have no idea what's coming. And I mean, it's not easy to just all of a sudden, geez, I gotta go for 90 seconds on this. It's not an easy thing to do, but I really love it. I'm the current reigning champion. I've won 4 out of 12 shows, so far so good. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So I'm a busy guy. I like being busy.
Apparently so. And like I said earlier in the episode, all the links to all the places where you can find Benny will be available in the show notes of today's episode. Benny, I can't thank you enough for your time tonight, man. This was a real treat for me.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. It's very, very enjoyable.
Before we get into the next segment of the program, my incredible interview and discussion with Evan Ginsberg, I'm going to play some more classic Ivan Koloff audio. Now, during the course of my conversation with Benny, and you're going to hear a little bit more of it during my conversation with Evan, we discuss we'll say legitimacy of the WWE Hall of Fame and our thoughts on that subject matter in particular. But I found some interesting audio of what Ivan Koloff thought about what he wanted in terms of being included in the WWE Hall of Fame. So I'm going to play this classic audio because I think it's really going to dovetail nicely into my conversation with Evan Ginsberg. And on the other side of that incredible Ivan Koloff audio, good friend of the show, Evan Ginsberg.
Kiddingly, I was going to say that Vince is probably afraid that I'll challenge him and whoop him, But I think probably he's holding out for another time, but maybe where the situation, maybe where I wrestled more, California, I wrestled a bit out there, but not a lot, so maybe he's waiting for a different location or something. So if it happens, I guess his life's got to go on, so I don't, I'm not going to cry over anything like that. Just, it was a little disappointing because after wrestling over 50 years and still being part of being around it, I end up, really love to have a little bit of the, royalties that may be involved and maybe the autograph sessions would be involved with WWE. And, but if that's not to be at this time, no fans, I'd still get some shots anyway, so, but maybe later on, I hope it'll work out.
You would think that they would want the most legendary villain possibly in their history, the guy who beat Bruno Sammartino after 7 years in the Hall of Fame, right?
Well, you'd think so, yeah. I think that I suppose, look, when you look at it that way, like I was actually the third person to ever have the belt, to get it from someone like a legend like Bruno. Yeah, the significance of it to me is real, to the people, man, that they would think that, man, what's this guy even alive today? Must be, it's not committed around. Just Bruno, myself, and a few others that still alive from that era, So, but hopefully it'll happen one day here, and not too long in the future, because I would like to be still in good enough health to be able to participate in doing some things after, and but I'll keep my fingers crossed here, and I know just go on with life, and probably Hollywood's going to call me anyway any minute now, or I'll win a big sweepstake or something,
Okay, thanks for having me on. Yours truly was the associate producer of The Wrestler with Mickey Rourke. I appeared in the film and acted with him briefly as well. Also the associate producer on 350 Days, starring Bret Hart, Greg Valentine, Tito Santana, 3 Dozen Legends. The producer of Wrestling Then and Now, which is also available, and stars Killer Kowalski, Don Dr. Death Arnold, Nikolai Volkov, and many others. The senior editor at Pro Wrestling Stories, and I have been following wrestling for 50 plus years, attending wrestling pretty much the same amount of time, and Ivan Koloff is one of my heroes, and I am glad to be able to speak on and honor him on this show, because you do a great job with this program, and happy to be back on.
So I guess before we get into the meat and potatoes, if you will, I gotta ask, why Ivan Koloff? Because to me, there's so many big stars that came out of that New York territory. I mean, you had San Martino's obviously a god, but you had the Moraleses, you had you name the star, they've been through there, right? It doesn't matter what decade it is, what era it was, whether it's the silver, the gold, the attitude, you've had everything there. What is it about Ivan Koloff, before we get into the actual story of him, that drew you to him, and why were you so fascinated by him?
Well, let me put you in the mindset of a 1970s wrestling fan. For the most part, we were blue-collar marks, and Ivan Koloff had held the WWF Championship, having beaten Bruno Sammartino at Madison Square Garden, and Bruno had been champion for over 8 years and was practically a saint in that market, a hero. And Ivan Koloff beating him, even though he held the title very briefly, had so much credibility back then that he was a perennial headliner. He headlined Madison Square Garden 13 times. 13 times. Wrap your head around that. That's a huge number for a heel opponent. And he headlined against Bruno, Pedro, and Backlund. He was always brought back as a main event star because that title win meant so much. And let me put an asterisk next to that. Stan Stasiak, who held the title even shorter, okay, same thing. Because he was a world champion back then, and it meant so much, he would perennially be brought back as a main eventer against Bruno and work the entire circuit on top. So back then, the World Championship, whether it was the NWA, AWA, WWF, it just meant so much more than today, where they'll pop a TV rating and change a title on a whim. And John Cena's 16-time world champion. Randy Orton's, God knows how many times he's champion. And it doesn't mean anything. You don't even remember who they won the belt from or lost it back to. it's just popping ratings. So Ivan Koloff had this unbelievable credibility, but also he was arguably the greatest foreign heel of all time. You could say Iron Sheik, you could say Nikolai Volkov, but in any discussion, Ivan Koloff would be one, if not the greatest foreign heel gimmick of all time. And a tremendous, tremendous performer, okay? You know, it's not just that he held the belt. You know, he was a wrestling machine. He was a powerhouse. They'd hurl him through the air like a projectile, you know, which wasn't always the case back then with massive guys like him, 275 pounds or 290 pounds, depending on the era or whatnot. I mean, Ivan was a great, great wrestler, great gimmick, great draw. And when you saw Ivan Koloff against Bruno Sammartino live at Madison Square Garden, there was this gravitas. There was like this awe and wonder. We were marks. He had beaten Bruno. On any given night, you're thinking he could beat Bruno again. Okay? And they had the very first steel cage match at the Garden, Bruno and Ivan, also in 75. So, you know, let me say something else. There was no entrance music. There was no pyro. There was no special effects. Bruno came out in a pair of tights. Ivan came out in a pair of tights. They walked down the aisle, and the building shook. The building shook. And I'm not exaggerating. I'm not being melodramatic. The charisma that both these guys had. And when these guys just looked at each other across the ring and locked up, it was like a gasp. Like, you know, the fans were riveted. You know, these were Marvel superhero and supervillain come to life. And Ivan was tremendous. And I would personally rank him in my top 10, easily in a top 20 of all time, and certainly top 5 foreign heel gimmick, as I said earlier.
So there's something you mentioned I thought was very fascinating. I want to circle back to before we get into the actual story of Ivan Koloff is how many times he main evented at Madison Square Gardens. Because again, we're talking eras where the lists of names were plentiful of stars that would come in, you know, assuming that Bruno was the champ or even if Pedro was the champ. You know, these stars would come in, they'd work a match, and many of them was only once or twice, right? You can go down the list of challengers for the title. Dusty Rhodes, for example, here's one, right? Certainly not 13 times like Koloff, I'm certain.
Dusty Rhodes wrestled Billy Graham twice on top for the title when Graham was champ. Twice.
And that's what I mean, right? You look at the list of names throughout history, and the fact that this one name, Ivan Koloff, keeps coming up, and that he was, as you said, just a consistently dominant force in that market and just drew the fans with that magnetism, if you will. To me, that speaks more about how he was able to connect with the fans as a foreign heel. This guy that you were paying to see him for one of two reasons. Either you were a sadist of some kind or some kind of a masochist, or you were paying to see your hero beat the wheels off him. And to think that fans would come out in droves 13 separate times to see this at that venue, the historic Madison Square Gardens, that in itself is quite the feat. I think that's something that needs to be, you know, we need to go a little bit more into that as well.
Well, let me just add something. back in the day, a sellout at Madison Square Garden was listed as 22,092. You know, whether that's exaggerated, whether there were comps involved. I mean, it's still 22,092 is an enormous number. So, and when they had the steel cage match, they opened up the Felt Forum, the adjoining venue, which held several thousand more.
Oh, that's right.
Closed circuit TV. Closed, like they used to do with Ali and Larry Holmes and, you know, Duran and Leonard, etc. Closed circuit TV. So you're talking an easy 25 or so thousand people. So when Triple H says, you know, Vince took wrestling out of bingo halls and VFW halls, you know, he's rewriting history. You know, the WWF, Vince McMahon Sr.'s territory, were huge arenas for them. I mean, there were smaller venues as well, but, you know, Madison Square Garden was not a bingo hall. It was, quote unquote, the mecca of professional wrestling, and Ivan Koloff headlined it time and time again because he was an amazing talent and an amazing draw with unbelievable credibility. And let me add this. Ivan Koloff and Billy Graham formed a tag team. And this is interesting, because people probably don't remember this or just weren't there. Ivan Koloff and Billy Graham would team. Also, they headlined the Garden. One night it was Bruno and Tony Parisi against Ivan Koloff and Superstar. And what would inevitably happen when they would wrestle is they would start arguing, and Billy Graham and Ivan Koloff would start pushing each other, and they would start like just about going at each other, and the fans were 100% with Billy. So when Billy said Vince should have turned me face, he was absolutely correct, because the fans would have loved him. He would have been Hulk Hogan 10 years earlier, 8 to 10 years earlier. And it's a shame, because he would have been a great face champion, Billy Graham, and Ivan Koloff would have been an ideal opponent. Ideal. Billy Graham versus Ivan Koloff would have been huge. And but Ivan Koloff had incredible heel heat at the time. Let me add something else, because, I'm 103 years old, and some of you younger fans won't know this. Think about every James Bond movie from the 60s and 70s. They were fighting the Russians. We were in the middle of the Cold War. The Cold War. So guys like Ivan Koloff and Nikolai Volkov were perfect heels as Russians. And as kids, when we were in school, we would have drills where we would literally hide under these ancient wooden desks for when the Russians nuked us. The wooden desks from 1937 would protect us from the nuclear bombs that would rain on us from Russia. So,
see, I figured it would have been all the lead paint on the schools.
Yeah, that too. But Ivan Koloff and Nikolai Volkov were perfect heels for that era. Ditto, the Nazi heels, Baron von Raschke, Waldo von Erich, Hans Schroeder, Kurt von Hess, Karl von Hess, etc. My father sat there. My father was a World War II veteran. So you're in the 1970s, World War II was only, 30 years behind.
Absolutely.
So, again, these were not internet savvy, smartened up fans, sheet reading fans. These were blue collar guys who this was their escape, and for the most part, not 100%, but for the most part, we believed them. Ivan Koloff was a legitimate threat to Bruno, to Pedro, to Backlund, etc., so on. And, add to the fact that the guy was a great wrestler, a great brawler, a great bleeder. Again, he even did high spots where he's flying through the air. The guy could do it all. He was, what I've seen thousands and thousands of wrestling matches, wrestlers literally around the world, and Ivan Koloff was as great as virtually anyone.
So it's interesting because, as you said, you've watched thousands of matches throughout. Whether it's, I'm sure, even if you would discount the live ones, whether it's on video or whatever.
I'm talking live.
That's what I'm talking about, right?
I started attending in 1974, so you're looking at going on 50 years.
So when you're talking about somebody who's as prolific as Koloff was, not even just in his prime, I'm talking like throughout his entire career, because he was a guy, as you stated earlier, right? Weight fluctuated, most guys do. That's, with age and time, whatever. But he was a guy, in my opinion, who adapted to his, or I shouldn't say adapted, but he changed his style throughout the years to incorporate different things, whether it was more brawling, whether it was more high spots, whether it was more of the blood, guts, gore, whatever you want to call it nowadays. Nowadays, they practically shoot each other in the ring, but we're not going to get into that, I don't think, right now. But he's one of those, he was way, way, way before his time in terms of reinventing himself in the ring. I'm not talking about in terms of a new character or a new way of presenting himself. I'm talking about the work in the ring, what he was able to bring to the ring. Is that something that you caught a glimpse of early on, and was that something that you were able to follow as his career progressed, especially in the New York market?
Ivan was a machine, much like Killer Kowalski, great cardio. The guy could just go 15, 20, 25, 30, 35 minutes, easy. The guy was a tremendous athlete. Later in his career, as your body starts to break down a bit, he was smart enough to reinvent himself as a tag team wrestler. The Russians, I saw him monthly with the NWA in Philly in the mid to late 80s. And he was still on top, and still great. Ivan and Nikita, Ivan and Crusher Khrushchev, the Russians. And it was basically the same spiel, those no good Americans, we're going to get those no good Americans. It still worked in the mid to late 80s. And I would see him on the NWA cards, and I tell people to this day, Crockett's NWA, mid to late 80s, was the greatest wrestling I ever saw live. I would travel New York to Philly virtually every month. You'd have Flair on top, the Horsemen, Ivan and the Russians, Midnight Express, Rock and Roll Express, Rick Rude and Manny Fernandez lower in the card, Jimmy Valiant and Billy Graham, who headlined the Garden a zillion times, lower to mid-card. Okay? It was the most stacked shows you could ever imagine. Better than a monthly card in Philly, NWA, that era, was better than any WrestleMania lineup. Any WrestleMania, believe me. And they would pack, it was like a 10,000 or so seat arena. And Ivan was always on top or near the top. I mean, the Russians' gimmick was huge. Nikita eventually branched out more solo. You had Nikita and Magnum doing the 4 out of 7 series, and Nikita eventually turned face. But the Russians were always, big stars in the NWA as well. He was never one of those guys who, got old and, lost it all and was jobbed out. It never came down to that. He was a star. I mean, from from the late 60s to the late 80s. And I'm glad he never went through, that decline that so many have, where to this day, I just cringe when somebody will say, Baron Cicluna, Jerry Valiant, Butcher Paul Vachon, etc., were just quote unquote jobbers, which is a derogatory term. They don't know that these guys were champions, main eventers, and I'm glad that Ivan never went through that. Where he was always a star, and he went out on top. He was never like he was the guy fed to the younger guys on TV. So I have nothing but great memories of him, and just basically for 15 years from 1975 to the late 80s, I saw him regularly, and he was always on top and always great. Always great.
So that's something that you just brought up a point, and I want to circle back to quick before you kind of progress any further, is the fact that he never was used as that, the washed up wrestler status, right?
Right.
We've seen it. I'm not going to list the names, and we've seen, the guys, even in recent years, right? They go from, now I'm going to date myself too, right? You see the guys go from the WWF to like TNA, and then they're the washed up guys, and they're just there for a paycheck. You saw this, from the 60s onward. There's many names you could name, and I'm not going to right now because it's not really the time or place to do it. But what I will say is that Koloff was never one of those guys who had the knock on him for being there for the paycheck. Right, he wasn't there to show up and do 10 minutes of stand up in the ring and hit the showers. Right, he was there to work, and he was there to, but not only work, but he was there to draw as well. And I'm glad you brought that aspect up, because you look at NWA in the even when he was there in the 70s, never mind, but also in the 80s as well. Right, he's still drawing. People are going to see him. He is the reason. It doesn't matter that maybe it's not 22,000 like MSG, but show me somebody today, anybody today, just about, who could draw 10,000 people with that person himself in a match against, name the opponent, but would that person himself and an opponent draw 10,000 in an arena today? Probably not. But Koloff was, and this is, almost 25 years into his career at that point. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. He another thing that I neglected to mention was Bruno himself. He had power as a champion for over 8 years. He said, Ivan's the guy I want to beat me. Bruno's body was broken down. Bruno was exhausted. Bruno wasn't a kid anymore. So he saw this unbelievable athlete who was credible, and it wasn't embarrassing to him to lose to an Ivan Koloff. He had nothing but respect for him. And if you look at Bruno's history, some of his, most prolific opponents who he wrestled hundreds of times was Killer Kowalski, Waldo Von Erich. These were great wrestlers.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Waldo Von Erich was fierce, and he was a big guy. Vince McMahon Sr. built the promotion around super heavyweights, because Bruno bench pressed, I believe it was 565 pounds or something. He was a powerhouse, so you had to have somebody who was big and mean and powerful and legit to be a credible opponent against Bruno. And even Backlund, because Backlund was, like a machine, physically an amazing, athlete. So Vince McMahon Sr. built it on, these big, powerful, credible guys, and Ivan Koloff. This guy was 275 pounds, and he could move. He was fast.
Absolutely.
Yeah, he could do it all. So, you don't headline the Garden 13 times if
if you're some slug. It is interesting, and I'll do a bit of a sidebar here before you get on track, but it is interesting that two of the most well-respected champions in history, Bruno Sammartino and Lou Thesz, handpicked Canadians to usurp them as champions. Obviously, the Koloff issue with Sammartino paid off in spades. Lou Thesz originally picked George Gordienko from Winnipeg, but with the immigration issues that obviously fell apart, and that if anybody's interested in that story, they can listen in season 2. We have a big deep dive in George Gordienko, but it's interesting that it would be two Canadian heavyweights, or should have been two Canadian heavyweights, to dethrone two of the longest reigning champions of their eras, holding their prestigious titles. I just think it's an interesting little side note, a little footnote in history.
Well, you also have to remember in the 1960s, it was not an open business with hundreds of schools and everybody and his mother's a quote-unquote trainer. Even Harley Race initially was kind of like held the veterans' bags and carried the bags around and had to pay his dues before he was trained.
I think he had to do a little bit of hygiene work for, I can't remember the wrestlers. It was that Haystack Calhoun, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right too. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway,
yeah, we won't get into that right now.
Yeah, that's a whole different story. But my point being, Harley Race, who's also one of the top 10 greatest of all time, you didn't just stroll through the door. So a guy like Ivan Koloff paid his dues and really learned his craft before going out into the ring and building his reputation and finding the right gimmick. And when Bruno quote unquote chose him and the promoters agreed on him, Ivan Koloff as the interim champion, it really meant something back then. Again, Bruno was champion 8.5 or so years. So when somebody won the belt from him, I'll tell you a funny story. I just read Bill Apter's book, and I reviewed it for Pro Wrestling Stories. It's a very good book. Bill Apter was covering the 1971 title change at the Garden, which was a little before my time. And so Stanley Weston, who ran the magazines that Bill Apter worked for, said, "Bill, you can't tell anybody. This is a big deal. Bruno's losing the belt to Ivan. You're gonna take the photos there. You can't tell anybody." So Bill Apter couldn't smarten up his dad. He couldn't tell his dad. Okay, it was so top secret. It was a different business, It's like now if a title's going to change, everybody knows it weeks in advance. And I mean, Bruno losing to Ivan was a huge, huge deal. People, it's a different world. You can't grasp the mindset of 50 years ago unless you were around during that period. And even Billy Graham beating Bruno, was a tremendous big deal. And that was only a 3.5 or so year reign. But a title change back then meant everything. Now it's, this is his 12th reign, his 13th. Charlotte Flair's number 7, number 8, number 9. It's like meaningless.
Well, and it's, it's the hot potato mentality. Unfortunately, we saw a lot of that start in the Attitude Era. So, and it's kind of progressed from there. Good, bad, or indifferent, it's here to stay, unfortunately. Maybe they're going to reverse it a little bit with Roman Reigns. I think he's had it for, 3 years or 4 years, but
Well, it's a very, very different business.
Oh,
now.
absolutely,
Roman Reigns-
100% it is.
Yeah, Roman Reigns will come in and wrestle some big pay-per-view in a new market, in Wales or whatever, against McIntyre, and it becomes, a big money event with big money packages. Back then the champion defended every month in the same arenas around the circuit, and they were expected to draw every month. So, again, Ivan winning was a huge story back then.
So here's something that's often not discussed, and I would like to get your perspective on it. So, obviously, Koloff ends the vaunted reign of Bruno Sammartino. It's just about 8 years long, right? It's like 7. It's like as close. It's like 7 and 5, 6, or 7 and 3, or whatever, right? Almost 8 years long.
I can't find the exact number, but it was around 8 years.
Yeah, absolutely. So he ends the reign. He holds the title for, I believe it was 21 days, and he loses the title to Pedro Morales. But at the time, and a few years after that, were people looking at Koloff like he was one and done, or did people think that he was actually going to come back and challenge and get back into the title picture for winning it again?
Well, that was my point. When he came back in 1975 against Bruno, it was a huge deal. They sold out Madison Square Garden 3 months in a row. 3 months in a row. Okay, you're talking $100,000 gates back then, which was a lot of money for that era, and and like I said, the first steel cage match at the Garden, and after he lost, it wasn't like he was diminished. He was still on top, tagging with Billy Graham, and what they would do back then is go to a different territory at some point and come back hot again. So in 78, he came back to wrestle Backlund, and he was on top again. So the guy who always had that credibility where he could main event.
Yeah, which is, so just in our quick inflation calculator, if you will. So 100 grand back then in 1970 is almost 400,000 now.
Yeah.
Which is, and like you said, the amount of times that occurred it's stunning almost, right? When you compare it to nowadays.
And that's just one venue.
That's what I'm talking about.
They go to Boston Gardens and Philadelphia Spectrum and all the major arenas up and down the East Coast, the WWF. So Ivan Koloff generated millions and millions of dollars for them as the heel drawer on top. So 50 years later, how is Ivan Koloff not in the WWE Hall of Fame? He's not on Vince's good list. Let's look at some of the quote-unquote allegations as to why. One, he was part of the concussion lawsuit that many of the wrestlers signed on to. So this, of course, would tick off Vince. Two, at one point, Billy Graham, Ivan Koloff, and Ernie Ladd went to Vince Sr. and said, we want more pay and we want equal pay because all three of us are on top and the draws on your cards. Okay? Even though they were not the champions at the time, I'm talking, 1975, 1976, the trio, who were the big heels of that day, said, we want to be paid more, and we want to be paid equally. Whether one's on top and one's in the co-feature, or one's on top and the other two are tag teaming that night, pay us more. Okay.
Okay,
3.
sorry, before you get to 3, because I just want to explain, because we have some listeners who are newer to getting into the history side of things, so before we get into 3, let's sidebar for a second and just explain to everybody how the pay structure would work on a show in the 60s, 70s, even into the 80s.
Well, Bruno, Johnny Valiant told me would get about $8,000 to headline the Garden, and his opponent would get more in the $2,000 range, which, again, for the fanboys who they all pissed it away, millions of dollars on Wine, Women, and Song. They have no idea of just how little these guys made. Many of these guys, pre-Hulkamania era, never broke $100,000 a year. They never broke $100,000 a year. So where they're pissing away millions of dollars, squandering their wealth is beyond me. It's a fanboy myth exaggeration. Yes, some wrestlers squandered their money, but again, before Hulkamania, mid-'80s, they were not making huge money. Okay, so you're on top at Madison Square Garden, the heel facing Bruno. You're going to get, with the exception of Bruno, the biggest payday of the night. So basically, it was almost like a mini union where Ivan, Billy Graham, and Ernie Ladd said, look, we're all the draw here. Pay us more, pay us fairly. And interestingly, the very next year, 1976, Stan Hansen and Bruiser Brody come into the territory, and nobody knew them. And it was considered a big drop-off in talent. You're going from Graham Koloff Ladd to Bruiser Brody and Stan Hansen. So it was just a freak thing that Hansen legitimately hurt Bruno, broke his neck or whatever the case may be. And it made Hansen a huge star. And Hansen and Brody teamed up at the time in the Tri-WF. But they were not considered, they were kids at the time, quote-unquote kids, and they didn't have that reputation. But again, these were big, huge guys. They were perfect opponents for Bruno. I saw Bruno and Brody in a cage back in '76. So, but it didn't have like that gravitas of an Ivan Koloff or a Billy Graham, particularly after Graham and Koloff won the belts. So let me just say one other thing that's a little footnote in history. Billy Graham and Ivan would come back time and time again to wrestle Bruno, even when Bruno wasn't champion, as the co-feature on Backlund's cards.
That's right.
Because it was such a draw. And up and down the entire Tri-WF circuit. So, Ivan generated a lot of money for them. So you have a third scenario where Ivan literally left the Tri-WF and went to Eddie Einhorn's IWA, which had TV across the country and was considered at the time some kind of competition or threat. And there's Ivan Koloff headlining against Mil Mascaras, who was their champion, because he was getting better money. And this did not endear him to the McMahon family competing against the WWF. So there were multiple reasons why Ivan is not on Vince Jr.'s good list and is not in the Hall of Fame, because I can assure you he's more worthy than 90% of the guys and women that are in there at this moment. It's petty. I wrote a piece for Pro Wrestling Stories. I called it WWE's shame Ivan Koloff not in the WWE.
Which is a true way to say it. And as
how petty.
As well, that link to Evan's article will be in the show notes of today's episode. So as you're going through your podcast player, please click on the link. You can read it. It's right there. There may be
your blood pressure will go up when you read it. I think that's true.
Well, so I want to stay on this topic because there is so much conjecture about why he's not in. Also, you look at the list of names that are in and he's not, which is unbelievable.
I just gave you
three reasons.
Three very strong reasons.
So
theories.
I'll give you 4, and I have a feeling that you personally may have a number 5, but I'll see. A fourth reason, and one that I always thought was interesting, is going back to our discussion about the the NWA, his time in the 80s when it was really hot, right? This is a time when many of the big stars, you had Flair, you had Rhodes, you had the Road Warriors were massive stars there, right? You had the Rock and Roll there, just the plethora of talent, as you illustrated earlier, was immeasurable, huge, and the fact that he would quote unquote leave the WWF and go to the NWA at the time, who were still rivals. There's a big split, and we can go into the history of all of that. It's probably too much to go into right now, but I had always heard, and perhaps maybe I'm wrong about that, but I heard that was a thorn in the side as well, because why would you leave the WWF, the WWF, and go to the competitor, I'm throwing that in quotations, and then be on top, right? Again, he wasn't a preliminary guy. He was main eventing. He was top of the marquee. He was drawing the crowds. And I always had heard that was one of the reasons that his name was kind of not blacklisted, but maybe we'll say pushed down the rungs a little bit in terms of recognition by the WWF, and now known as the WWE nowadays.
It could be a cumulative effect of all of those things. It ultimately comes down to money, and Ivan wanted to be paid fairly, and he went where the money was. And when he was sick for several years with cancer, sadly, WWE still wasn't gracious enough to put him in the Hall of Fame, and they had GoFundMes, and they were hawking T-shirts. How disgraceful, that this guy didn't have a pension, a 401k, health benefits, etc., when he spent so much time, so many nights working for the McMahon family. Utterly disgraceful, and whatever the reasons may have been, the guy deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. He wasn't quite the wrestler that Pete Rose was, but...
Oh, God.
I'm joking, obviously.
You're talking about your article is going to make blood pressure. I think you just made mine.
Yeah. But maybe at some point when Vince, who controls the WWE Hall of Fame good list, the Hall of Fame is basically his good list. Maybe at some point they'll put him in, or in that ridiculous, what do you call it, Legends Wing or whatever.
Oh, yeah, when they... Because Lord knows they have to have their quota of, wrestlers who have passed on, that's a whole other ball of wax. I'm sure we're not going to get into tonight.
Just, when you dump a Ray Stevens without even bringing up his family or doing it right, it's disgraceful. So, maybe at some point they'll do that for Ivan once Vince is really out of the picture or eventually gone. But when he was sick and dying, and it was known that he was sick and dying, they should have been gracious enough and done the right thing and put him in while he was here to appreciate it. And, this is a ruthless corporation. They don't, it's not the way they're wired. So thank you to you for doing shows like this and keeping memories of, guys like this and John Tolos and all these great wrestlers, to devote an hour or 2 hours to somebody. There are times WWE won't devote 10 seconds to acknowledging somebody who passed. They didn't mention Lanny Poffo when he died on their TV. This was a dear friend of mine. This man slept on my couch. This was a friend of mine. Okay? To not mention him because they're pushing some inane, stultifying angle that insults your intelligence. You can't spare 10 seconds. Okay? They very, very, very briefly put a picture of Ivan up there, if I remember correctly.
I think you're correct about that, and that's about it.
That was it. And no Hall of Fame, no video tribute. Pretty much, So, what can I say? I don't want to belabor the point, but, thank you for doing shows like this because for his family, for his friends, for his fans, and for history. Because, okay, you're not in the Hall of Fame. So a show like this is really going to chronicle and honor somebody much more so. You're not going to see an Ivan Koloff documentary coming from WWE Films.
No,
they don't care about.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
Which and I'm not going to get into the documentary aspect of it and what they do and do not do in terms of that. And you know what? I will say I'm thankful that there was no Dark Side of the Ring episode on the concussion lawsuit, because that would have been just a crock. And we all, you personally, my feelings about that whole series and the way that they portray things. So I'm kind of glad that hasn't been a thing. And I'm not trying to give them any ideas in the next, few years, but it's not only chronicling his career and things like that, but it's also trying to get the perspective of somebody outside of Canada, right? Because he had, obviously there was a big impact here in Montreal. He was very, 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 very well known, even though he was the Russian Bear, right? They knew, right? And he
headlined Maple Leaf Gardens like everywhere else.
And they loved him. They love to hate him, certainly too. But it's interesting to hear your perspective, because not only did you watch him, you grew up watching him, you moved into adolescence, but then you also went back and you looked into him when you got into the writing side. And that's what I think is fascinating, is that this is somebody who's stuck with you through the years, like a John Tolos, who we've mentioned many times, right? But here's somebody who, and it's not just you personally, but that whole area, that era of wrestling fan. Here's somebody who, from a foreign country, because Canada still is a foreign country in terms of America, right? Here's somebody from a foreign country, a French-speaking province on top of that, and comes in and leaves an impact, a lasting impact on an entire generation or generations. And to me, that's the story. That's what I wanted to illustrate to people tonight, or today, or this morning, whenever anybody's listening to this, this is why he should be discussed and remembered. Whether or not he's in some fictitious Hall of Fame is irrelevant. The facts speak for themselves, and that's the real reason about doing this program tonight.
Well, let me add this. Why is somebody like Ivan Koloff so important to me. When you look back at the best nights of your life, you spent it with your late father, who took you as a kid or as a teenager or both to the matches, and you're sitting there together enjoying Ivan Koloff. So my father died when I was 20. So when I look back at my life, there were many nights where my father and I saw Bruno versus Ivan Koloff at Madison Square Garden, Nassau Coliseum, headlining also Nassau Coliseum, major arena. And these were great, great nights that you spent with your beloved father. And for somebody else, it could be your mother, your uncle, your aunt, whoever it was that took you as a kid. Let me take it another step. As an adult or a quote-unquote wrestling journalist, sometimes I cringe at that term because a lot of wrestling journalists can't write.
No. They also can't do a whole lot of things.
It's a whole different episode. You meet an Ivan Koloff and you approach a hero. The guy's nice. The guy's so nice and gracious and warm and friendly and accommodating. Oh, yeah, I'm happy to sign this for you. Nice to meet you. And you're not disappointed. It's not the Undertaker charging $200 for an autograph or a photo op. Okay. Mm-hmm. It's a fan meeting a hero, and the person lives up to your expectations of who this person is. And on so many levels, the guy, he never disappointed you in the ring. And as a person, let me just say this. Okay. I have a love-hate relationship with this business. If you watch 350 Days, you're going to see some, it's not all happy, the documentary that we made. These guys had a tough road. Okay? So you talk to anybody in the wrestling business about Ivan Koloff, and they're going to say he was great in ring, and he was a great human being. He was a great person. They're going to say that about Terry Funk. They're going to say that about Roddy Piper. They're not going to say that about everybody. Okay? There's a select list of people who are beloved in this industry that did not leave a trail of, angry, disappointed people who were disillusioned after their encounters with them. Ivan Koloff was beloved and is years after his death beloved in this business, and that is not always the case. Believe me, Nikolai was the same. When Nikolai died, speaking of Russian heels, not to go off on a tangent, but when Nikolai died, Bret Hart, who wrestled everybody, said Nikolai Volkov was the nicest wrestler I ever met in this business. That's right,
yeah.
He said that. Yeah, I'm quoting him. So you will get the very same sort of reactions with legends when they talk about Ivan Koloff, and let me take it to the next step. As a writer who has interviewed many, many, many legends over the years, inevitably the legends, not the fanboys who go Roman Reigns is the greatest of all time or whatnot, the legends will tell you the greatest of all time were Buddy Rogers, Lou Thesz, okay, and you'll probably be surprised, prime Ray Stevens. Those are the guys, the legends, inevitably the older legends cite as the greatest of all time, right? That same rarefied air, Terry Funk, Ivan Koloff. Bruno, not that he was a great, great wrestler, but because he was just so respected and beloved, Harley Race, Nick Bockwinkel, and a handful of others. But inevitably, whenever a legend talks about Ivan Koloff, it's with reverence. Reverence. Okay? And I'm just stating this, not an opinion. That's a fact. I've interviewed hundreds of legends over the years. Whenever Ivan's name comes up, oh, he was great. Guy was great. He was great in the ring. What a nice man. What a great person. You know, that's the reaction. And I don't know what else to say, short of rattling off results and statistics, but, nothing but respect and love for this guy. And among my greatest memories of being at wrestling and seeing him on top. And he was fierce, like Kowalski. He just kept coming at you. The cardio, the guy, this. And eventually, sadly, because of all the bumps, because of the thousands and thousands of matches, his body started to break down, and he was in a lot of physical pain, and he just couldn't do it anymore. And that was pretty much it. So, your body gives it. Or, as the wrestlers like to say, there's only so many bumps.
That's
on your
right.
body.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and he was smart enough not to hang around too long. There are guys, I'm not going to name names, but there's guys who just hung around too long.
We don't need to get into,
Yeah, and they were a shell of what they were, and people don't even remember how great they were because they stayed around way too long. And but Ivan never made that mistake. He left an impeccable body of work, and luckily, not all, but a lot of it still exists. He was still a big star in the 80s, and you could watch a lot of his stuff on YouTube or Peacock, WWE, whatever the case may be. A guy like John Tolis, who I'm writing a book about, there's not a lot of his footage. It was erased. The chintzy promoters would tape over the TV just to save $25 or $50 on a tape, and so a guy like John Tolos is more lost to history. Ivan Koloff, there's plenty you can watch and enjoy, and it's a little piece of immortality where you could just go to YouTube and there he is. And I'll tell you, I haven't. It's almost like a melancholy experience. I'll occasionally watch an old match from the Garden, and and there's so much charisma, like a Bruno versus Ivan. There's so much charisma, and then you start to wrap your head around it, and you go, Bruno's gone, Ivan's gone, the referee's gone, the announcers are gone, and it hurts. It really hurts, and I could go beyond that. I mean, as somebody who went pretty much every month back then, I'll look in the audience and see people I know and go, Georgie Ann Macropolis, the wrestling writer, she's gone, but the beauty of it is, one day we'll be gone and your show will still be out there and Ivan's matches will still be out there and the movies I make will still be out there or whatnot. And Ivan has a little piece of immortality. Why? Because he was great. It's not churning out vanilla content like WWE a zillion hours every week. Ivan was great, and it'll live forever, and in his own way, like a movie star from 100 years ago or 50 years ago. He'll live forever, and it's a beautiful thing.
I guess before we finish up tonight, is there anything else that we didn't cover that you think that we should get into?
I hope that maybe through fan pressure or whatnot, people will tell WWE, put him in the Hall of Fame, because that would be the final, cherry on the top, or whatever the expression is. He deserves it. I think it will introduce him to many who were too young to have seen him or really know of him. And, even the NWA stuff from the 80s, that's 40 years ago. If you look at 35, 40 years ago, we're going into 2024 shortly, 1985 to 1990. It's a long time ago, even when he was in the NWA.
Hey, easy now. Some of us were born in 85.
Yeah. Well, you're a lot younger than me. So, every once in a while I'll see his widow online, and she's very appreciative when the fans speak well of him and speak highly of him. So I know a show like this will mean a lot to her and his family, and but if you're asking me for one last point, I would say let the fans, or the WWE Universe, let the fans tell them, put this guy in the Hall of Fame finally. It's the right thing to do. He more than deserves it. It's not even debatable, does he deserve it or not? It's whether they're willing or not. So I'd like to see it. I'll tell you a funny story. I grew up in a black neighborhood, and I grew up on R&B. And I said, before I die, I want to see the Spinners in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and Ivan Koloff in the WWE Hall of Fame. They just put the Spinners in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So you got to fulfill my final wish.
It's time.
Yeah, put Ivan in there for WWE. If not, my vacation plans over Christmas, I'm going to go visit the WWE Hall of Fame in parts unknown and spend quality time in the Ivan Koloff wing. That's what I'm going to do. Anyway.
Oh, that's tremendous. Well, thanks, Evan. This is awesome.
My pleasure. It's from the heart. It's really the guy was just so great, so great. It's hard to even put it into words. The guy. Oh man, I hope that millions more over time will discover him and appreciate him, because there's a zillion wrestlers, but there's few and far between as great as Ivan Koloff.
Before we wrap up tonight's episode, first off, I want to thank my two tremendous guests tonight, Benny Scala and Evan Ginsberg. You can find links to their projects in the description of today's episode, the show notes, if you will. I really hope that you'll take the time not only to read their articles on Ivan Koloff, but also to check out their other projects. You heard the plethora of projects that both of them have on the go, and I also hope that you guys check out what they are up to in the very near future. Evan has something in the works that I'm really excited for personally, so I hope that you guys will give those articles a read and give their projects a look-see, if you will. I also want to thank you, the listener. We are in Season 4 because of you. If you could do me the biggest favor and hit that follow or subscribe button on whatever podcast platform that you are listening to this program on, it would mean the world to me. As well as if you are able to leave a 5-star rating and review. Once again, it's one of those feel-good things that I like to get once in a while. So even if you don't, still, thank you very much for listening, and I hope to have some great content for you in Season 4. As we wrap up this episode, I think the best way to wrap this up is to hear Ivan Koloff in his own words. Now, this audio I pulled from one of his seminars that he had, I believe it was just a couple of years before he had passed. But I think it's a really great showcase of just what a down-to-earth, honest, and truly warm-hearted individual he really was. And I think that's about the best way to end this episode. So I will sign off as I usually do by asking you to take care of yourselves and each other. And I really hope that you enjoy this last piece of audio. My friends, Ivan Koloff. Thank you.
I believe that if I had a chance to say it, and every time I have a chance to say it, I do it. I turned my life over to the Lord in 1995 out of necessity. I was raised in church, Roman Catholic Church. I thought because I went to church that I was a Christian, and consequently I didn't have all my things in priority, my life in priority. I ended up going out there and trying to find happiness through drinking, drugs, and the wild party life, and thinking that I was doing the thing of this world, like everybody else. There are a lot of other people I figured were doing, and it was the thing to do. And realized that in the early 90s, after I quit the WCW, and saying, man, I got to get out of these drugs because I got really in bad shape, from marijuana to pills to the cocaine and the drinking. I was a mess. Should have been killed dozens of times at least, and came close a couple times. And I ended up being approached by my nephew Nikita, and on the phone, and he says, Uncle, he was excited, I want you to show up at the church, Assembly of God Church, on Sunday night. I says, why, Nicky? He says, well, I think I know what you need in your life. I said, Nicky, I was raised in church. I know who Jesus is. He says, so does the devil know who Jesus is, but knowing who he is and accepting him is two different things. And that really got my attention. So I went to the church like he suggests I do. And so I say now, this day, I got Nikita into wrestling, but I got the best of the deal. I got the Lord into me, because I went to the church that day and I was convicted of what the preacher was saying and realized that that was the truth, that God made us in his image, that I was a sinner, and that the only way I was going to get to heaven was to ask Jesus to come into my heart, because he was the Son of God, and that he died for my sins and was raised from the dead, and that price that he paid for my sins too. All I had to do was accept him and have a relationship with him. And I did that day. I ended up asking for my heart. And I had quite an experience that day, because God touched me in such a way that I couldn't deny that he was for real. And I'll leave that to your imagination. But I was really taken back, to say the least. And I was told to get into the Word, because the Word would renew my mind, would increase my faith, and that's what I needed. I needed Jesus in my heart. I needed God's Holy Spirit, and that's the way you do it, by increasing God's truth, his Word. I just went on faith and just started reading the Bible. Didn't make a lot of sense to me. Tried to pray, didn't know a lot about prayer, and struggled a little bit with the drinking and chewing tobacco and that, but I couldn't afford the cocaine no more. But I asked God to clean me up of all this stuff, and he did. Just a matter of time. Was cleaned up from the chewing tobacco, and then the marijuana, and then the drinking, and so it's not an issue with me no more. If I take a prescription, I'm conscious of it. But if I just went back to the doctor, because I was on for injuries, I was on some pills, Vicodin. My kidney numbers are up, so Vicodin's hard on that. So I went back and got on another one that wasn't so hard on the kidney. So you got to watch yourself anyway. You got to, and God tells us that, that the truth will set you free. The truth is God's Word, and he says that we need to look after our bodies. So not only what we eat, but the way we take care of it by pills and all this stuff and consuming stuff. But he's good. God's good, just to be able to do that. And to me, that's the whole essence of my life today, is to be able to go out there and share that with people. And I try to do it when I'm doing autographs for Children's Miracle in the last 20 years, in the last 15 years at least, doing the autographs since I became a Christian, 17 years now. And but I go to churches. I got ordained here 7 years ago and perform ceremonies for weddings. and just love to go to churches and brag on the Lord. And, of course, go to the events anytime wrestling like this is really a treat because I get to see some of my old friends like today here at Winston-Salem. And man, it's great to see guys like the Rock and Roll Express and Barbarian, and guys like that, Jimmy Valiant, the Boogie Woogie Man. And even though they beat me up and gave me a bloody nose often and busted my lip and that, it's always good to see because you get to respect guys like that, Good to see them again. But got a good wife, got a couple babies now, daughter who sings gospel, really good. She got my talent, she don't got my talent, but my hair. I claim it. I say, I don't have the hair no more and I don't have the singing voice anymore. She's got it. She's really good. And
This has been your episode of Grappling with Canada. This episode was written, researched, produced, and recorded by me, Andy the Taxman. You can find Grappling with Canada on all major podcasting platforms. Please make sure to rate and review 5 stars where available. You can also find Grappling with Canada on all major social media platforms. Just search Grappling with Canada on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. If you are willing and able to financially support Grappling with Canada, you can find links to PayPal and buymeacoffee.com on the Linktree link in today's show notes. You can also find links to the Grappling with Canada merchandise store in the show notes for today's episode. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with your friends and family. This is Andy the Taxman saying, thank you very much for supporting and listening to this program. Take care of yourselves and each other.